What does it mean to be successful? For most of my life, I equated success with the acquisition of material items. Plain and simple. I figured if I had a better car, a bigger house, and more expensive clothing than other people, I was successful. And when I was 21 years old, I actually achieved that kind of success. I started making some pretty decent money on YouTube. I wasn't rich by any means, but I was making more, much more than your average 21-year-old. And I splurged on pretty much everything you could possibly imagine a 21-year-old with this kind of mentality would splurge on. I went and got a brand new BMW on an expensive lease payment. I got an expensive apartment that had so much extra space that I literally did not need as a 21-year-old who was living alone. And I even went and bought some jewelry on a loan. I pulled out loans to buy jewelry because I just wanted to appear successful. I wanted other people to see that I had achieved the American dream. And as you can imagine, that did not work out very well for me. My YouTube income dropped substantially about 6 months later, and 6 months after that, I was living in my car in Los Angeles. And being in LA gave me the opportunity to see the top of the top and the bottom of the bottom. LA is a very unique place, even amongst the United States of America, in that you will see on the same street people who are probably worth over 50 million US dollars and people who are living in tents on the street, surrounded by needles and bodily fluids. And what I realized was that the American dream isn't really real, because if your idea of success is predicated on being better than your peers, then is that really true success? Because when I went to the Netherlands and I lived there for 14 months, what I quickly realized was that although you may not see quite as many people who are worth $50 million and living in these $20 million homes, you'll also never see people living in tents surrounded by needles. At least I personally didn't. And what I realized was that, hey, this is indicative of a successful society. And ever since then, my perception of what it means to be successful has changed. I realized that success is not something to be indulged in at the individual level. It's something to be experienced at the societal level. And I suspect that David Wen here agrees. Hence why I am reacting to this video about how the Netherlands shattered his American idea of success. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this reaction because I'm really curious to hear what he has to say about this.
The average American will work 10 more years than the average European, but live 3 years shorter.
Well,
The American philosophy is work hard, save for retirement, and then relax.
but
90% of their savings will never be used by the time they die. Is this the American dream? Living in the Netherlands changed the way that I view success.
It's interesting because that reminds me of a video that I reacted to maybe a couple of weeks ago. You might know which video I'm talking about, where the guy was saying that leaving the US and moving to Europe saved his life. And in that video, he explained that his father, who obviously lived in America for the vast majority, if not the entirety of his life, had saved his money. He was extremely frugal for 60 years, from the time he was a teenager all the way up until he retired. He was very frugal, he made all the right decisions, and he was rewarded by an early death. He didn't even get the chance to experience the fruits of his labor. And I think a lot of Americans really need a reality check when it comes to the systemic pressure of Americans to make all of the right decisions, even though it's supposedly the wealthiest nation on the planet. And that's not to say that personal accountability is not important. Of course it is. People should make good decisions. And Dutch people, being as frugal as they are, definitely make good decisions. But they also don't see life as this carrot at the end of a stick that they're always chasing but never quite catch. And I think most Americans, for whatever reason, maybe just due to a lack of exposure to other options, they chase that carrot, and by the time they realize they'll never catch it, it's too late.
As an American, it's been about 3 months since I've been back in California, and I have a lot of reflections to share. But today, I want to focus on a big one: success. Now, of course, we each have our own definitions of success, but what I do know is that this definition is heavily influenced by the cultures and systems that we are a part of. So let me start with the past, what America taught me about success. Fast forward to the Netherlands, how the Dutch changed my definition of success. And then we'll bring it back to the present day, how I'm trying to navigate America with this new definition. And then we'll go towards the future. I'll share some eye-opening stats that change the way that I view money, time, and what actually matters at the end of life. But first, let me tell you a story about labels in America. About 14 years ago in San Francisco, I started my career in a company called KPMG in public accounting. It was a good company. Until one night, I went out with a group of friends who were all investment bankers. And this girl comes up to me and asks me the big question, "What do you do?" And I tell her, "I work at KPMG." And then she looks at me. She looks down on me as if public accounting wasn't good enough. Now, you could say Dave.
It's interesting because I've reacted to a few of David Wynn's videos in the recent past, and that's the second time I've heard him tell that story. I can tell that story really rubbed him the wrong way, and rightfully so. There's nothing worse than people belittling your accomplishments, because ultimately, it's your life to live. And people feel like they have the right to impose their standards, their expectations on your life, where maybe being an investment banker wouldn't make David happy. But for a lot of those types of people, I'm not saying all investment bankers, but a lot of people who choose those types of professions, it's not about happiness, it's about being perceived as successful, which is why they project it onto people like David, who clearly, as you can see, is doing pretty well for himself. As the years have gone on, he's built up a great platform on YouTube, and he seems like a very intelligent guy, so I don't know what he does aside from YouTube, but I'm sure that he is doing just fine in life, and he's probably a hell of a lot more happy than that miserable girl who asked him that question.
David, you're thinking too much. But I was young, and that's the culture that we are born into in America. We grow up learning to label, to compare, to sometimes judge. And it starts at a very young age. Success is defined at an early age. Let's go back to high school. You start to see more labels on people. Captain of the football team, all-state debate champion, president of the recycling club. I was none of these, by the way, but people in high school start collecting labels. And a big reason is because colleges look at these labels in the admissions process. It's not just about your test scores, but it also depends on what you do outside the classroom. And
this right here is something that I suspect a lot of Europeans are not actually aware of. Maybe even a lot of people from the previous generation aren't aware of, because I know that when I was trying to get into college, when I was, I think, 17 years old, my parents didn't understand that it wasn't just about getting good grades. I got great grades in high school, exceptional grades, but when it came to extracurricular activities and test scores and all of the other things that you see right here, I did pretty much the bare minimum. I did the bare minimum to get into the college that I wanted to get into. And they just didn't understand that these things actually carry a lot more weight than the baseline competence in the one thing that matters most. And I understand that American colleges are trying to produce well-rounded members of society. I get that. I totally understand that. But at the same time, to David's point, it creates this pressure, this undue pressure and stress on the youth to essentially chase these labels and compete and dominate their peers, when in all actuality, they should be learning to work together. And you see this a lot with the class ranking system, for example. I don't think Dutch schools have this. Based on what my girlfriend's told me, correct me if I'm wrong on this, because maybe it's different in different regions, but in the US, you have a class ranking system where, according to your GPA, your grade point average, again, I don't know if Dutch schools use that metric right there, but according to your grade point average, they literally rank you. They assign you a number. And for what it's worth, I think I was around 70. I think I was in the high 60s or low 70s out of around 1,000 people. So again, I did very well, but even at that time, I felt like I didn't really perform to my fullest capacity. And you saw people who were valedictorian and salutatorian. I remember I had English class with some of these people senior year of high school, and I just felt so inferior to these people that I never talked. I literally never talked because I felt like my words didn't carry any value at all in the context of those group discussions. Ironically, I guess my words do carry some value because I run a YouTube channel now. But the point is, I think that all of this right here just creates a lot of unnecessary stress, and it's probably a big part of the reason why Dutch children are the happiest children in the world and American children are not.
Getting into a good college, it's extremely competitive, so you need to stand out. I remember the week of college acceptances when people got accepted into the school of their choice, a top school. They bought sweaters and brought them to school to show off, of course. And you could see the people that got into good schools, the great schools, Harvard, Stanford's, Berkeley's. These were the successes of the class.
And the comparison game is even worse now with social media. Everyone seems to be getting into a good college.
But I can also imagine those who didn't get accepted into a top school or a school of their choice. I can imagine how bad they felt. So I studied hard, volunteered, worked part-time, played for the baseball team, and participated in clubs.
And you know what the worst part about that is? When I really sit here and think about it, it's the fact that as students, we're not actually trying to learn the subjects. We're just trying to get the grades. At least me. That's how I approached school. I just wanted to get the highest class rank I possibly could, but I didn't care about actually learning the material. And I didn't have to learn the material to get a high class rank. So I think that just goes to show that the American public schooling system is definitely behind. It's not as bad as it could be, but it's certainly not as good as it could be either.
All in order to pretty up my college application. And eventually, I did get accepted into UCLA. So I had my next label. I go to UCLA. Success meant getting into a good school. And then not long after, what job do you do? Where do you work? Success meant getting a good job, a good company. You are what you do.
So also, I just want to mention, it seems like his definition of success followed more conventional societal standards. For me, I didn't really care about those things. Again, it was pretty much entirely about materialism. And I think a big part of why is because I consumed a lot of rap music growing up. And rap music, especially in that era of the mid-2000s, pretty much exclusively talked about that. So our definitions of success were pretty different, but fundamentally they were the same in that success was seen as who you are relative to the people around you, not who you are in isolation or who you are relative to who you want to be.
Then I went to the Netherlands to do a master's program. And very quickly, I learned that success wasn't about being the best. I remember my first exam and I got a 7.5 out of 10, but that's actually a B plus in the US system. But I learned that many of my Dutch classmates, they got 5.5s, 6s out of 10, which meant passing, and they were happy, satisfied. Now, in the Dutch system, unless you're applying to a very competitive program, all that matters is that you pass. So for me, I didn't have the pressure of getting the best grade, so I could actually focus on learning. Now, this is a very important point I want to make. In America, as kids and teens, we are conditioned to believe that success is equated with good grades, a good school. In the Dutch system, there isn't this level of pressure for kids to succeed. And what helps is all universities there are generally pretty good, and they don't pay attention to rankings as much.
That's a big thing right there. That actually blew my mind when my girlfriend told me about that, was that they don't really have that same type of hierarchy within the Dutch higher education systems. In the US, there is a very big difference between going to Harvard and going to the University of North Texas, for example. Completely different. Even though the quality of the education may not be nearly as different as what the difference in prestige might indicate, that difference in prestige is there, and it will actually affect your opportunities later on in life for most people. So that right there, I think, is a very big pro of the Dutch schooling system. It's just that lack of hierarchy, because all the schools, to his point, are good.
As Americans do. And as kids, these subconscious beliefs about what success is, these external labels, they stick with us through life.
So I graduated from my program, found a job, and moved to Amsterdam.
And what I noticed was when I met Europeans, the first thing they asked me wasn't, "What do you do?" Of course, the question does come up, but when people ask, I don't get the sense that people are judging you based on what you do. And you could be unemployed, in transition, working at a cafe. Nobody really cares. Someone working at booking.com isn't better than someone working as an artist. You see,
It's interesting because he raises a really, really good point there, which is that when Dutch people ask you that question, at least in my experience, when they ask you what you do, because I did get that question, especially when people found out I was American, they're asking because they're genuinely curious. Whereas in the US, more often than not, they don't really care. They're just trying to figure out what kind of value you can provide to them. It's a very transactional mindset, and a lot of it is subconscious, to his point, but it definitely taints and tarnishes the genuineness, if that's even a word, of a lot of conversations.
people as people, not by their job titles. And that was really freeing. Success wasn't defined by job titles. And it's not just about job titles. Personal success is different culture by culture too. I met a woman who's an immigrant in the Netherlands, and she told me that she wants to have kids, but unfortunately she can't. Now, back in her home country, she felt judged. But in the Netherlands, no one judges you because you don't have kids or you can't have kids. And she felt a lot more free. I've also talked to Chinese girls who immigrated to the Netherlands as well. In China, if you aren't married by the age of, say, 27, you're considered a leftover woman. Now, these girls, they wanted to get married, but they didn't get married by a certain age.
That is crazy. Leftover woman is an insane label to place on somebody just because they didn't get married by a certain age. I never understood that. I never understood why people would associate success or desirability with being married by a specific age. Because if you end up with the wrong person and you get divorced, it wasn't successful. You weren't as successful as that standard indicated.
Certain societies, success is defined by you fulfilling certain roles and responsibilities, and that creates a lot of pressure. Now in the US, there's a lot of societal pressure. We're taught to stand out, to show off. So you only see people's successes everywhere, all the time, which creates a big spotlight effect. You believe that people, society, they're watching you, and you compare your spotlight against other people's spotlight.
That's a big one right there. That's a big part of the reason why. And of course, again, personal accountability is very important, and I take full responsibility for my actions, but if I didn't see other people my age or younger going out and getting nice cars and nice apartments, I probably don't go out and get that $720 a month BMW lease payment or get that $1,200 a month apartment. Maybe I get a $900 a month apartment. Comparison truly is the thief of joy, and what I found is that comparison is also the thief of freedom in many cases.
Now, that can create a lot of fire, ambition, but that can also create a lot of pressure to be successful. In Dutch culture, you're taught not to stand out. Don't brag. And of course, there's still pressure in Dutch culture, but when you don't see as many people showing off, there's less pressure. And
so I'm going to defer to what he just said there because he spent more time in the Netherlands than I did, and it seems like he also interacted with more people than I did out there. But in my personal experience, I didn't really see the whole do normal thing as a restriction in any sense of the word. I personally felt completely free to just operate at my own discretion. I will say, when I told people I do YouTube, I got a lot of very questionable looks, but again, it was more due to curiosity and just a genuine lack of exposure to that, because the culture of doing YouTube is simply not as big out there. But I never really felt like I was being negatively judged for what I did, if that makes sense.
when you don't have as much pressure, you feel a lot more free to define what success means to you. But let me get back to work. I was still a workaholic in Europe. While my colleagues were using their 5 weeks of vacation, I could barely use up my 2 weeks. I didn't know how. It took me about a year to finally get the European way of life. And then I started to work more regular hours. I started taking my vacation. I spent more time traveling, seeing family and friends, pursuing my hobbies, and I felt happier. But I was still productive in my career. I still continued learning, growing. And then I realized there might be a different definition of success.
I love that he mentioned that he was still productive and still growing within his career, because I've been reading this book about the 80-20 rule, and that's something that I completely surrender to in terms of life principles. I feel like in Europe, and especially in the Netherlands, people just have a much better understanding of doing the tasks that actually matter. Whereas in the US, it kind of feels like you just do a whole bunch of nothing most of the time. At least at the jobs that I worked at. They were lower level service industry jobs, but I vividly recall they just gave us busy work sometimes. It was almost like I was being punished for being efficient. And I absolutely hated that. I hated that so much. So I can only imagine what working an office job, a salaried office job, is like.
You don't live to work, but you work to live. So this is what the Dutch taught me about success. Success isn't only achieving and realizing your potential. Success is also having the time to spend with yourself, with your loved ones. Success is feeling inner peace.
Well, after 7 years in the Netherlands, I return to America, where the real test begins.
I'm back in San Francisco, under a tree, and it feels very different, the cultures. I was at a social event the other day and talking to 2 guys, and then a third guy comes over to our group and asks, "What do you guys do?" And based on our responses, our jobs, where we worked or didn't work, he focused on one guy, and they connected on LinkedIn, and he invited him to an event he was hosting, and then he left and went to the other group. It felt very transactional.
That right there, that's crazy. It's one thing to ask that question. I get in the context of that kind of event, it might make sense to do that. But to literally just act like the other people in the group aren't there just based on their responses is insane to me. I did attend a social event similar to that one time, and I do remember just the feeling of going from group to group and having those transactional conversations. And wouldn't you know, I never contacted any of those people ever again after that night at that social event. Go figure. It's because I actually crave deeper, meaningful relationships. but clearly a lot of people don't. And I remember very vividly as well. I know I'm kind of getting off topic here, but just bear with me. There was this guy named Seth. I think I was 21, and this is that version of myself I was talking about earlier. So I pulled up in the BMW and I had the nice clothes and all of that stuff. This guy, Seth, he looked like he was maybe 19 or 20 years old. And I don't want to say he looked intense. He almost kind of looked dead on the inside. That's maybe the best way I could explain it. His eyes were just bloodshot, and he was wearing a suit. And I remember thinking, wow, this guy looks pretty young. I'm going to go talk to him. He seems pretty interesting. And he proceeded to tell me that he was working something like 60 or 70 hours a week. And I just remember that look in his eyes where you could tell that he just was not enjoying life at all. And maybe that sacrifice was worth it. I don't know what Seth is doing now. I hope he's doing well. But that's a pretty big sacrifice to make. It's a really, really big sacrifice to make. He did not seem like he was enjoying life in the slightest bit.
You worth knowing. Of course, San Francisco is an outlier. People come here to work and to build, but it also reminded me how important status and labels are in America. But to be honest, I still see labels, but the big difference between now and 7 years ago is that I'm more conscious of it. And it doesn't have to be that way. We don't always have to talk about work. Where are you from? What brings you here? What are your summer plans? I have found those questions more successful than the question of what do you do? But you have to be prepared when people do ask you that question, what do you do? And right now, I'm just okay telling people, hey, I just got back to the US and I'm spending time with family. I also make videos about American and Dutch culture, and I would really appreciate it if you subscribe, comment, or support me on Patreon for...
Speaking of subscribing, it's interesting because I just thought of another little difference in those interactions where people ask me what I do. I noticed that in the Netherlands, when I tell people I do YouTube, they might look up my channel on the spot, albeit much more rarely than in the US, but they never really comment on my subscriber count. That seems to be a big thing in the US, where when I tell people, oh, I do YouTube, because that's pretty much always how I answer that question, they'll go to my channel and the first thing they'll say is, wow, you have a lot of subscribers. And I guess to me, it's kind of normal because I've had over 100,000 subscribers since I was 21 years old. So I've completely normalized it in my head, but they comment more on that. And that right there just further proves his point. It's all about the labels.
For a coffee a month. There you'll get exclusive content, early access, and I can answer any questions you may have. But more importantly, your support helps me to make more of these videos. And it's okay if you don't. I appreciate you for watching. And let's get back to my midlife crisis. In Silicon Valley and San Francisco, success is often about moving fast. Now, that might work well in business, but what I've learned from the Dutch is that it's okay to slow down. It's okay to take your time. Unfortunately, many Americans don't have time. Many Americans work longer hours, and they still only get 2 weeks of vacation. And even with 2 weeks of vacation, most Americans don't even take the 2 weeks because they feel like they might fall behind. Now, in the Netherlands, most people take 4, 5, 6 weeks of vacation, and they have one of the shortest working weeks in the world, 32 hours, because many people work part-time. Yet, they're still one of the most productive countries in the world.
If I'm not mistaken, if you're Dutch, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the reason why a lot of people work part-time is because when you work beyond a certain number of hours, or if you make beyond a certain amount of money, I forgot what the amount is, you're no longer eligible for certain government benefits, which for a lot of people would actually prove to be a net negative because you're working more and you're actually, in the grand scheme of things, making less money. Correct me if I'm wrong about that, but I think that's the reason why part-time culture is so big in the Netherlands. But again, a lot of people, they don't realize that most of what they're doing is completely useless. I mean, even with YouTube, for example, I've pretty much pruned out all of the unnecessary fluff when it comes to YouTube or just my business in general. And I just focus on the core elements that actually matter, which is making videos like this one. And that will always get me the most outsized returns for my investment of effort. For as much as America talks about being the entrepreneurial capital of the world, it seems like a lot of businesses operate very inefficiently.
And studies do show that having control over your time is the most important predictor of well-being, more so than career prestige or money. So I'm trying to remind myself of that.
I promise I'm not going to keep pausing the video. It's already a long video, I know, but that is so true. That's so true. That's the biggest reason why I wanted to be an entrepreneur when I was younger, was I hated waking up early and having to sleep early. Oftentimes I didn't, and I would just be sleep deprived. You could really argue that I started this business just so that I could wake up when I want and just do what I want when I want. I could film these videos when I want. I can go to the gym when I want. I can take my girlfriend out on a date when I want. I have control over my time, and that is the greatest form of wealth that there is, because you can't get more time.
That because right now I do feel pressure to get moving, to get working, and I will, but I'm also going to take my time.
But time does go by.
A few birthdays ago, someone wished me, "Welcome to midlife." Now, I don't think I'm there yet, but time does go by faster as you age. But it also reminds me how short life can be. One of my best friends died at the age of 31. And in the past 7 years, I've also had friends, colleagues, loved ones pass away too. Not everyone is guaranteed a long life or good health. So how do I want to spend the rest of my time? Well, living in both Europe and the US reminds me of two very important facts. The average American will end up working 80,000 hours over a lifetime. The average European will work around 60,000 hours. So the average American will end up working 10 more years than the average European. The American philosophy is work hard, save for retirement, and then relax. And then I'm reminded of the book Die with Zero, which changed the way that I spend and save.
I still can't wrap my head around that idea. I just genuinely can't. And you can even go back to my oldest videos. My very first video where I actually talked to the camera, I was explaining why I dropped out of college. And even back then, at the age of, I think I was 19 years old, I had just turned 19 actually, I couldn't wrap my head around this notion of sacrificing 40 years of your life so that you can start doing the stuff that I'm doing right now in your 60s. I just couldn't wrap my head around it, especially with all of these new tools, these technological tools at our disposal. Just couldn't wrap my head around it, and I still can't, especially now that I'm actually, again, living the life that a lot of Americans are working 40 years to obtain.
In the book, it talks about a study that showed that the average American retiree only ends up spending 11% of their savings by the time they die. In other words, many Americans oversave and underspend. I'm also reminded of the book, The Top Regrets of the Dying, and one of the top regrets is, I wish I didn't work so hard. Now, many people need to work a lot in order to survive, and work is a very important part of society. It gives us money, it gives us purpose. For many, it's their life's mission. This isn't about an individual's personal choice, but it is about the choices that are shaped by our cultures, our societies. In the American system, it's great if you want to build a business. The Dutch system, it's not perfect, but from my experience, it's great if you want to build a high quality of life. And it's a system that gives you the opportunity to build a career, but also have a lot of time freedom. Again, this depends on what success means for you, but it got me thinking, what would make a successful life?
One thing I will say, a lot of people have this kind of misconception. I'm not saying David has this misconception, but a lot of people do believe that it's much more difficult to start and operate a business in the Netherlands than it is in the US. And personally, I found the exact opposite to be the case. It was a very intuitive and straightforward process. Even doing taxes, it was all super straightforward. and they just streamline the whole process for you. Of course, running a business is hard no matter where you are. It's always going to be difficult, but considering that there was also a language barrier where most of the documentation was in a language I didn't even understand, I still found it relatively easy to navigate that process of registering with the KVK, so on and so forth. So I don't really know where that idea comes from. Even taxes, I actually think I pay more taxes in the US than the Netherlands, at least for the time being.
The end of life. Growing up in America, I was taught that success meant making money, climbing the corporate ladder, being the best. In the Netherlands, the Dutch taught me a successful life meant having the freedom to be yourself. A successful life meant having enough, not necessarily more. A successful life meant having the time, freedom, to choose how you spend your time. Now, can I achieve that here in America? Can I pursue my dreams and still have a lot of time freedom?
He left us on a cliffhanger there. He left us on a cliffhanger. But I'm curious to know, regardless of where you're from, be it the Netherlands, the US, anywhere in between or beyond, what is your personal definition of success?